Hello, welcome to the No Way Jose podcast. This week again, I'm joined by Matt Wolfson. We're continuing on our series we're calling the Weekly Wolfson. The alliteration ends at 2 this week since it's not on Wednesday. Hello, Snafu, but we're recording here on Saturday. The patrons will still get this a little bit earlier, but for those who are enjoying this series and want to keep seeing more of it, then be sure to hit the subscribe button, hit that bell for notifications so you can see when new episodes are dropping and when I'm going live, doing some streams. And also go ahead and go over to oppo dash or hyphen research.com to keep track of all the pieces Matt's putting out. If you want to get a fuller experience than just hearing me and Matt give the commentary on the pieces, you can go read them yourselves. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get to the show. We'll see you in it. You guys, we'll see you in the show.
No way, Jose.
The following footage proves beyond any doubt that the tanks intentionally set the house on fire. It proves that the Branch Davidians were murdered. You can see that this tank has a gas jet on the front that shoots fire. You can also see the fire quite plainly. The tank goes into the house twice, and each time as it backs out, the fire at the gas jets is plainly visible.
We must all do more to recognize and look for the early warning signals that deeply troubled young people send.
Hey, Matt. Pleasure to have you joining the show again. Looking forward to doing another one of these weekly Wolfsons. We'll be talking a little bit more about the Hindutvas again. All this, though, this time I think we're taking a little bit more of a focus on the Hindutva Zionist fusion tactic, essentially. So I look forward to going into all of that. Really get into, I don't know, in this piece, we talked last week a lot about the Hindutva stuff. You wrote a piece last week. This piece kind of really brings a lot of stuff to fruition. Like I said, it kind of goes into the fusion of the two. And then I also think starts getting to some of the juicier characters for many of the people paying attention to today's zeitgeist. The characters are like, oh shit, and kind of really puts it in full display. Kind of, I don't know how they're cooking the goose here, ever so. I don't know, effectively, I guess that would be a way to put it. But pleasure to have you back with us again, Matt. Here's the piece right here that we're referring to. It is a Supremacist Alliance, the Zionist Hindutva Hijacking of America. It is published over the Institute. I know we can't see the full picture on here, but I do think just to do it justice, I do a show. It's a pretty cool little art thing that the selection that you made, because you see these two trees.
Not me. It's my editor. It's Hunter Durensis.
Oh, well, the Hunter did a good job because it cuts it off. I just wanted to point out, you see the two trees in the foreground, the White House in the background, but then you look below it and you see the roots kind of interconnect and have a little handshake. So you don't get to see the full picture. So I just wanted to point that out. The two pillars that are being created, the two diaspora politics that are uniting to control the White House. So, Matt, pleasure to be with you again. I guess dig into this wherever you want. We have plenty to talk about here, plenty on the bone.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jose. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. The way this really started is that I've been looking at the Hindutva issue for some time, and some people, related to the Libertarian Institute, Andrew Cockburn, Jose Nino, have also been looking at it. And I wrote these two pieces, the one we discussed last week and then this one, and I'm always sort of looking for a way to get into the issue. And the week before we talked about this, I'd sort of used Laura Loomer and her sort of incipient alliance with Hindutvas, given that she's spoken very critically about Hindus and Indians and HB1 visas in the past. I mean, so I sort of used that as a way to get into the first piece. The second piece was sort of the way I got into it was more personal interest, which is Raja Krishnamurthy, who's a U.S. representative. He's Hindu. He was born in New Delhi, raised in Buffalo, and in Peoria, Illinois, and then in Chicago. So central and northern Illinois. He ran in the U.S. Senate primary for the Democratic seat, for one of the two U.S. seats in Illinois for the U.S. Senate, which is de facto goes to a Democrat. There hasn't been a Republican in there in a number of years. And he ran in the primary against a woman named Juliana Stratton, who's the lieutenant governor. And I'm from Illinois. I grew up in Springfield, which is, an hour and a half away from Peoria, 3 hours away from Chicago. Springfield's the state capital. That's where the lieutenant governor is. I have family in Chicago. And so I was the lieutenant governor has as her communications director somebody who was a classmate of mine, who I knew fairly decently in high school. And so I just sort of was very interested in this primary contest for the U.S. Democratic Senate seat, because whoever won the primary, which was in March, and Krishnamurthy, the Hindutva, in fact, lost, Stratton won, but whoever was going to win it was naturally going to become the next U.S. senator from Illinois, because the Republicans don't have a big voting base anymore because of Chicago. But I was very interested in this contest because to me, it sort of showed the two sides of the Democratic Party. And one side is Juliana Stratton. And if you're not a Democrat, and I have a feeling most of your listeners, including myself, are not, there's a lot not to like in Juliana Stratton's Democratic Party, which is essentially Barack Obama, who's also a Chicago native, his Democratic Party. You've got the old Chicago wards, which are very corrupt. You've got the public sector teachers unions, which are very corrupt. You have the city administration, which is very corrupt. You have the big Democratic philanthropist, J.B. Pritzker, which is really corrupt. So she's not somebody who, when I look at her, I'm like, oh, I'm so excited for this person to be in the Senate. On the other hand, when I look at Krishnamurthy, I saw something much worse. And so I was rooting, which is like not my natural approach. I mean, most people from Springfield, Illinois are, conservative, and they don't really want the establishment Democrat to win ever. But when I looked at Krishnamurthy, I saw something much worse, which is, he is based in Chicago. He's a U.S. representative from Illinois, but he's not really based in the community. Like, to the extent that, Juliana Stratton is a politician, she needs to get support by putting on staff somebody from my high school in Springfield. She needs to get support from the public sector unions in Chicago. She needs to get support from the wards. Whatever their flaws, these are parts of the party apparatus, the Democratic apparatus, that are kind of close to the ground. Like, they interact with real people. You may not like public sector unions, but there are actual normal people who get up every day and go to work and pay taxes, whatever, who are part of them. Krishnamurthy is not like that. Krishnamurthy is funded. One of his biggest funders was the chief technology officer of Palantir. Krishnamurthy is a Princeton alumnus who was a lawyer who is funded by a variety of big consultancies, big law firms, deeply connected to Washington, D.C. Krishnamurthy is funded above all. I mean, I'm quoting here or paraphrasing the Chicago Tribune, which published a really critical article a couple days before the primary. Krishnamurthy is funded by a bunch of Indian and primarily Hindu technologists, financiers, people tied to Narendra Modi, the prime minister, who overtly embraces Hindu supremacist ideology. Krishnamurthy is completely a product of the imperial sort of ruling class who we, have spoken about often in the past. Those people who think, because I'm successful, in corporations and law firms and the government, in the military. And because I'm part of this small group, Jews or Hindus, it means that I'm better. And in fact, we as a group are better because we have been more successful in technology, in corporations, and all these very narrow engineering, administration, all these very narrow fields of expertise, which, the founders of our republic would not recognize as having anything to do with character. So Krishnamurthy to me is someone who has no connection to anybody except his funders. And in the primary, and I didn't get into this in the piece, he played really dirty. There were all sorts of, unpalatable anecdotes in the Chicago Tribune article, which is linked in the piece. Very much about the fundraising, very much about undercutting his opponents by, triangulating, using minor issues against them, things that are not outside the realm of politics, but really often show up a lot when, people without a lot of connection to their state or their community get involved because they want to use money to pay for a bunch of ad buys and flood suburban districts. People who aren't paying attention to politics, but who might vote in the primary, and say, well, let me use X issue against this candidate that really doesn't have anything to do with anything, that really doesn't have anything to do with any issues on the ground in the state. And so I found myself in sort of the odd position of rooting for Juliana Stratton, who I'm sure is very corrupt. A lot of her policies I don't agree with. Because to me, it was such an obvious issue of unwarranted influence from outside of a state or a community by someone who wouldn't know his constituents, who doesn't really care about his constituents, but is using, his stature in the military corporate complex and his membership in a minority group as an example of why Democrats should elect him. And so I started with Krishnamurthy, who's really a character in and of himself. I didn't get into it in the article, but he does not appear to be a very nice person. And then I sort of branched out to look at, where does a move like this, sort of a strong arming in to a primary where he didn't really have the support, he was relying a lot on outside donors. What does this have to do with sort of the broader trend of, these small groups, Hindutva Zionists, coming in, using outside funding, using their connection to Washington, D.C. and the Ivy League and corporations and law firms to try to swing elections. So that's really where the piece started. And then, as you mentioned, from there, I tried to set it in a broader perspective.
Yeah, a couple of things that stand out to me is for one, you did make a focal point of kind of honing in on I guess you're getting at what you can extrapolate things really got out of hand around the Civil Rights Act, and that there could be something to that. Which I've probably, if anybody's followed my show for any period of time, I'm not particularly a fan of the Civil Rights Act. Not that I'm necessarily against people having actual legitimate rights, but I'm more of a property rights guy. And once you get into these weird realm of like civil rights, it gets super ambiguous, and then it's like this right to not be discriminated against, and you're like, well, under what circumstances? And there becomes this like flip side thing where certain groups learn to kind of ride off of this. And now, before I hand it off to you, because there's something to that, I also find it interesting that now with this pairing of the Zionist Hindutva thing, it gives a whole lot more, instead of becoming more ethnic driven, it gives far more cover to the idea of this being a meritocratic concept. Since it's multiple races being covered, it gives you far more cover to being accused of being, stumping for one race or against one race either. And it also kind of takes, I think you quoted Ackman as saying anti-Hindu and anti-Jewish sentiment being a regressive movement against merit. And I thought that was like quite a almost ingenious way of framing, of saying it in a way that you're no longer doing the flimsy, limp-wristed accusation of racism. Now it becomes takes on this almost more sophisticated idea of, well, you're just against things being better and you just don't realize it. So I just think that's kind of something about the mixing of these two groups together kind of gives it this extra power and this extra cover, kind of, I guess, a little bit of a hide the ball.
I think you're dead on. That really gives me a lot to chew on. I'm going to find myself, I introduced this as I found myself cheering for Juliana Stratton, sort of the more progressive establishment candidate, which was a surprise to me. And now this is going to be the theme the whole way through, because you made such a good point when you said, there's this kind of limp-wristed accusation from parts of the Democratic Party that if you're against a candidate for a particular reason, you're against them because of race. And the Hindutvas and the Zionists, people like Christian Murthy, people like Ackman, they've made it more, as you said, sophisticated, hard line. Actually, you're against merit, and you won't accept that merit comes in many different colors, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I am in no way a fan of racial politics for all sorts of reasons, but there is something honest to some extent about saying, you don't like me because of my race, because I'm Black. I mean, Black people in this country until the 1960s and in different ways afterwards, have been in different ways put on the blunt end of federal power and federal exclusions in a way that, what the outsourcing that hit the white working class, that hit the Black working class first, the assault on masculinity that hit the white working class, hit the Black working class first, right after civil rights, because that's when they started outsourcing jobs. Civil rights and, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in 1865, they were for the purpose of redressing an actual inequality in America, which is that Blacks couldn't vote, Blacks couldn't have certain jobs, Blacks couldn't have houses. I mean, in certain communities, that was actually true, right? But what happened with civil rights is, yes, the Black community pushed civil rights. I mean, Martin Luther King was the grandson of a founding pastor of one of the major Baptist denominations in the South. Martin Luther King came up in the church. The Black church, which was founded as a response to slavery, is a place for Blacks to come together and resist, essentially. The Black church was one of the major drivers of civil rights, but there was another group of people who drove civil rights too. And those were people I mentioned in the piece, the WASPs and elite Jews. So elite Protestants, elite Jews, who were increasingly becoming Zionists, were major backers of civil rights in the 1960s. And you can still see this. I mean, when Bill Ackman makes an argument, when Barry Weiss at the Free Press makes an argument for meritocracy, they often use civil rights. They often cite Zionists who were part of the civil rights movement. Well, what their participation in civil rights did is it really made the movement about something other than what the movement was meant to be, which is to redress the wrongs, and I do think those wrongs were legitimately wrong, that were done to Black Americans. Civil rights was, and if you talk to Blacks on both the right and the left, I mean, I've heard this in X spaces, look, this was supposed to be for us, but the majority of our lives don't seem to be improving. And the reason for that is the people who put civil rights into practice, who put the laws that were passed into practice, were WASPs and elite Jews, increasingly Zionists, in Washington, D.C. They were the lawyers, they were the corporatists, they were the administrators, they were the consultants, they were the political consultants. It was very much of a top-down enforcement process. And what that allowed them to do is frame civil rights in terms of color blindness, where if you call out any particular group, or if you have a problem with any person who's not a white American, you are discriminating. Well, that really wasn't what caused civil rights. I mean, when Martin Luther King marched for civil rights, he wasn't talking about mean, he framed it in certain ways, yes, but he wasn't talking about Jews or Hindus or Chinese or women or transgender people or gay people. And civil rights laws have been applied to all of them. He was talking about the Black community. There was segregation in the South. I mean, but the people who made civil rights into law, they weren't, for the most part, members of the Black community. They were people in Washington, D.C., and their solution to the problem was, let's make civil rights be a way to talk about everybody in America, where discrimination is now something that we have to combat on behalf of all of these different groups. We need to bring all of these different groups into these big institutions in Washington, D.C. Never mind whether we should have these institutions to begin with. And so they used civil rights for their own purposes and framed it in their own way. And they framed it in terms of colorblindness and merit, which is to say, no matter what the color of your skin, no matter what your faith, no matter what your ethnicity, the best person should be picked for the job. And, affirmative action should exist because some of the good people have been underlooked because of systemic discrimination. But basically, affirmative action is to get good people who've been underlooked into the system. Well, the problem with that is nobody's asking, how are you defining merit? What is this system that you're saying people should get into that proves their merit, no matter how they look? Well, the system is a system that was set up basically after 1945 by WASPs and Jewish elites that says, if you're good at engineering, if you're good at legal administration, if you're good at corporate consultancy, if you're good at management, if you're good at any of those things, you should be a leader in America. If you're good at organizing people via a union, if you're good at organizing people in a ward, if you're good at setting up a small business association, if you're a family doctor in a small town, it's not really your business to make political decisions. You just do your thing. And the people doing this, these WASPs and elite Jewish, elites, they backed up this new set of priorities with legislation. And one of the lines I say in the piece that I'm sort of proud of because I think about it a lot is that, and I've never actually put it out there, is that 1965 is most famous to people for the Civil Rights Act. But there are 4 other things in 1965 that were actually a bigger deal in the long run, in my view. One of them is we entered Vietnam. Robert McNamara, who was, a WASP elite straight out of central casting, went to Harvard, ran Ford Motors, then became Secretary of Defense, biggest corporation in America, etc. He got us into Vietnam. The Johnson administration talked to corporate consultancies, at the time, Arthur Andersen, people today that are, today's corporate consultancies are Bain and Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey, their forebears. He talked to them and they said, you need to help corporations cut costs in manufacturing by putting factories in Mexico and making a special deal with the Mexican government where you start to import goods, which of course undercuts American labor, in the name of lowering consumer prices and lowering corporate costs. So those were the first 2 things, Vietnam and the outsourcing. Then there was the war on crime in inner cities where Black people had been for a very long time limited in the jobs they could get, in the neighborhoods they can live in. Inner cities were having a problem because a lot of young Black men couldn't get jobs and they weren't happy about it. And the WASPs and the Jewish elites in the Johnson administration said, let's send a bunch of Harvard-educated social workers in to try to reform these young people. And if they won't reform, let's send in the police. And there was this massive amount of funding that started in 1965 and continued for the next 50 years on what we know as the war on crime. Surveillance, helicopters, all sorts of federally funded equipment that made policing in cities far more similar to a military operation than domestic police activity. And so all of these Black people who were, for example, in gangs, well, Irish and Italians had been in gangs 80 years before. They weren't getting, SWAT teams weren't coming into their house and they weren't being thrown in prison for 20 years. But that was the case for the Black community that was already being hit by outsourcing. So in all of these ways, outsourcing the war on crime, sending working class men, Black and white men, to Vietnam, all of these things empowered corporations, the military, the government at the expense of regular laboring people. And then there was a fourth and final thing. And this was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that was passed by that was proposed by the Jewish Zionist Congressman Emanuel Seller. And what Emanuel Seller, the point of the act was to bring in high-achieving upper middle class, because they were educated professionals from India, from China, from Korea, from Nigeria, to help staff American universities, to help staff American, Washington administration, law firms, etc. And the stated purpose was to compete with the Soviet Union. India, China, they were part of, China was sort of allied with the Soviets. India was not. It was part of the non-aligned world during the Cold War. We were trying to bring in members of other countries so they would come closer to America against the Soviets. The other reason was diversity. We want diverse groups of all kinds. Well, the big thing that gets left out here is class. I mean, you're bringing in people of different color and different faith and different nation, but they're all from the upper middle classes to staff these new positions that are increasingly running America from Washington, D.C. Americans weren't run from Washington, D.C. before 1945. Now the government not only set up huge new administrative and corporate hegemons to run our economy and de facto control aspects of our lives, they brought in people from abroad. And if you objected, it was said, you're racist. You don't like people of color. You don't like Hindus. You don't like Jews, just like you don't like Blacks. Well, in the meantime, Black people, like the white working class, were being left behind. So, sorry, that was a really long answer, but you gave me a lot to chew on, because you're dead right. They've perverted, or the function of this has been to pervert what civil rights is supposed to be, what anti-discrimination is supposed to be, in order to let a bunch of upper middle class technicians tell us what to do. And if we say no, they say you're racist. You don't like people of color, et cetera, et cetera.
You're against merit, and I think one great example of this, which is almost kind of a parody of it, once you just claw just an inch deep into the actual the actual story behind the man. But Vivek Ramaswamy, you honed in on him. I think we may have mentioned him in passing in the previous episode, but he kind of takes a focal point in this piece, as well he should. I don't think you mentioned this one, but I do always find it rich. He's lauded as this this paragon of merit almost, and this idea of like, well, I really cracked down and I did my homework and I went to Yale and I did this and I did that. Meanwhile, the bulk of his millions is due to a pump and dump scheme for an Alzheimer drug, where he took his mother, who was a geriatric doctor, and took her off like she literally came out of retirement to essentially greenlight the drug for him, and then dumped it knowing that it was going to go to shit and whatever the next trials were or whatever. And then even then, on top of that, even add a little extra level of parody. Apparently, I've heard his dad is like legitimately an illegal immigrant. So he's just like not even trying. One more thing to add in too. Why this isn't even another good example of the Hindutva Zionist, the dual pillars here paradigm, is I forget the name, but apparently there's this like specific Zionist dinner that's been going on for a long time, and maybe you might know this. I just learned this little factoid recently that apparently I think he was the first Hindu that started getting invited to this like Shabbos dinner that like some Zionist group held, some like famous Zionist group, and he kind of literally became their Shabbos goy Hindu. And he is like I don't know, he's made like a big deal. Anyway, it's just like a Zionist group.
Oh my God, you're right.
Yeah,
You're
what
right.
is it?
It's something at Yale. I mean, and I have to read this. I just got it in the Deseret News. Inside
He's literally
Yale.
a Shabbos goy, dude.
Oh my God. I got to read this. Thank you, man. I had no idea. I mean,
Yeah, well, go ahead.
ahead.
I was just gonna say, I was just pointing out the ludicrousness of all of it. Like he is exactly kind of what we're talking about. Yet he was lauded. This like kind of like the same Elon Paul Bunyan type nonsense that we got fed. Like, look at these great men. You know, this like Ayn Randian vision almost. Like, look at these great men of business, and you're like, these are usually generational wealth utilizing corruption and connections.
I think you're dead. I think you are 100% right. I mean, I first heard about Ramaswamy, I think in 2022, 2023, because he was, gearing up to run for president. And I went to CPAC twice. And the first time I was there, I didn't really know anybody. And I actually got asked twice, sort of out of nowhere, one by someone who worked for him and another by a woman who knew him, if I wanted to go to a private event with him. And I was very nice, but I actually said no. And I said no because I knew that Bill Ackman endorsed him. And having seen that Bill Ackman endorsed him, I read some of his commentary and I thought, this is Ackman on steroids. This is the Zionist sort of approach on steroids. And, that wasn't the type of I knew what I thought is he wasn't a real populist. And he clearly, based on what he's done the last couple years, is not a real populist. I mean, he's in no way about the people. I mean, he might talk about gun rights, but essentially he doesn't like, as he said in one of his books, that corporations have gone woke. And that because he thinks it's anti-merit,
Yeah.
And that's the main part of his focus besides technological development. I mean, essentially making Ohio, where he's running for governor, into the next Silicon Valley. But for me, the Ackman link, because Ackman endorsed him for president for a while, the Ackman link was a real tell. And it's interesting to talk about Ackman in this context, because you mentioned, we're told to think of these people as great men who have done it on their own. And, in the past, this narrative is not new. The Paul Bunyan, Horatio Alger, young man go west narrative. It rags to riches isn't new. John Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, they used this as a way to buy into the WASPs and then justify their wealth. But they at least earned it. I mean, they were monsters in many ways, but they actually were coming from nowhere, and really, really struggling in the oil fields, and then they bought into the WASP elite who sort of adopted them. But, which is another story. But if you look at a guy like Ackman, this isn't well known, but it's public information. Ackman's father is one of the he passed away a couple of years ago. He was one of the most influential real estate developers in New York in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. And those were the years in which New York became very hospitable, thanks to the influence of Zionist financiers, to the government funding all sorts of real estate development that displaced the working and middle class and turned the city into a place where tourists came and Arab sheiks came. I mean, wealthy tourists and Arab sheiks and tech companies. And Ackman's father was a major part of that. I mean, then Ackman went to Harvard. Then he found mentorship from Zionists there. Then he was backed by a series of very connected players on Wall Street, and he is seated to where he is. Ramaswamy he went to Yale. He met his wife. I think he went to Yale Law. He met his wife, who I think was at Yale Medical School. They were both, in my understanding, from upper middle class families who had emigrated to America. I mean, this is the Kamala Harris story too. Her parents were doctors. Usha Vance, J.D. Vance's wife, who has been claimed by Hindutva networks and has not disavowed them. Usha Vance, her mother is the head of, I think, UCSD Medical School. These are powerful, well-connected people who know how to get ahead in these various systems. And they didn't make it from nowhere. They're not, the way somebody like James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or any of the early Americans who weren't, WASP elites talked about Americans ideally as self-sufficient, equal to other people. You own your own plot of land. You build a business. You don't try to take power that isn't due to you, but you exercise your right to self-defense. You exercise your right to property. You exercise your right to participate in politics. None of that, which is our traditional version of merit, has anything to do with these people. Not only are they succeeding in fields which nobody in our earlier history would have recognized as particularly meretricious. Okay, you're good at engineering. You're good at setting up. You're good at managing people. That doesn't mean you have a right to decide on my life. That doesn't mean you have a right to rule me. That means you're good at something. Not only are they good at things that we would not have recognized as things to aspire to, but they also come from very connected places. So they're not even succeeding in these narrow ways on their own terms.
Yeah, and one other character that kind of we talked Vivek, but one other character I think is one we really need to keep an eye on. But a lot of people I think gets missed for this when it comes to looking at this Zionist Hindu kind of network, and this is the more sinister one that really everyone needs to be. Although don't be wrong, the Vivek thing's pretty sinister too, which we'll probably circle back to that here in a minute. But it's J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is, this is current vice president. He's kind of this political puppet of J.D. Teal. As you mentioned, his wife is Usha Vance. He was also the roommate of Vivek, as a child named after Vivek. They're close buddies. This is, if you look at the Zionist networks that, kind of precede him, what do we also have? Like the people from Yale, like you have Amy Chua, which is someone I know you've written about in the past, so it seemed to be some sort of mentor of him and his wife, I believe.
And Vivek.
And Vivek, and then also his right hand man. Now, even just looking at the administration now, it's obviously very clearly incredibly Zionist. So this is kind of the next guy they have, and kind of clothed in this like aw shucks Pax Americana type feel, despite that feeling incredibly flimsy. I feel like for anyone actually that has even touched that demographic even slightly. But either way, something to keep an eye on. Luckily, it looks like the Trump administration's probably shit the bed hard enough that he probably won't have any shots in the next go round. But after that, he's a dangerous contender and somebody to be looking out for, especially when we have he's already been given basically the full force of TPUSA behind him, which I don't really know what to make of that entirely. I guess I believe he was buddies supposedly with Charlie, so I guess maybe it kind of makes sense. But either way, a lot of people made a big deal about how with Charlie that like he could have been president one day with the infrastructure he created. TPUSA seems to be has lost a lot of its luster since Charlie's been gone, but even still, looks like he's got the infrastructure behind him. He's got the proper establishment characters. He kind of tries to ride this line of populism, not populism. He does try to lean to this meritocratic thing as well, somewhat, although I don't know. I've never been particularly impressed by him. I know he does try to, market himself as some sort of fringe, new age, right-wing philosophy kind of guy, somewhat. I know he's like kind of teased some of the internet, sphere when it comes to philosophy, the Yarvins and people like that. So kind of give people like, oh my God, this is actually a thinking man. He's kind of embroiled in like the cool ideas. So I mean, he's somebody to look out for. All this, like, as we've been kind of talking about, the Zionist Hindutva kind of 1-2 punch here.
Well, you've been on to him since last November. I mean, the first article I wrote about Amy Chua in February in Al Mayadeen, I mean, I think I wrote you right after that because saying, I've really got something here you might like, because, I mean, you've been on him since November, and I wasn't sure still at that point. I was just sort of parsing through different connections I saw, and I wasn't entirely sure, and I knew that Tucker Carlson's son was working for him, and now Tucker Carlson's son stopped working for him 5 days ago. I mean, so you were right. Yeah, Vance, I mean, to me, Vance and Vivek increasingly seem to be a very similar person. Vance did not come from elite networks. He came from, as everybody knows, poverty. But once he got to Yale, he was adopted very quickly by Usha Vance, who became his girlfriend, and Amy Chua, who is an Asian American professor married to a Jewish Zionist who co-wrote with her Jewish Zionist husband a book called The Triple Package: Why Some Groups Succeed in America and Others Don't. Basically making the argument that J.D. Vance made in The Hillbilly Elegy and Vivek Ramaswamy makes constantly, which is that immigrants from certain backgrounds have better traits than most Americans, and that's why they're able to succeed. Now, it doesn't mention class differentials, it doesn't mention connections, and it doesn't mention the fact that most Americans don't really want a giant system of corporate government, and they don't want to be good at those things, and they don't want to be ruled by people who are good at those things. But she wrote a whole book on this with her husband that Vance, positively reviewed in 2015 in National Review. She was invited by Vance to Trump's inauguration. Attended. And if Vance, he's not just, surrounded by Amy Chua and Amy Chua's friend, Barry Weiss at the Free Press, who's given the only long form interview. Usha Vance has given her only real interview so far as second lady to Barry Weiss, the Zionist. He's not only connected to those networks, he's also, as you say, a protege of Peter Thiel in Silicon Valley. And increasingly, I mean, the New York Times ran a story about this. I mean, it's shocking to me. I'm actually going to see if I can pull this up. The New York Times a couple days ago ran a story about Vance's fundraising. And almost all of the names in there were Jewish Zionists. I mean, Paul Singer, Stephen Schwartzman, Miriam Adelson, John Paulson. I mean, reading this, you would think you were looking at Marco Rubio, or you were looking at Vivek Ramaswamy, but you're looking at J.D. Vance. And I'm just going to put this in the chat in case it's of interest. I mean, you can, because it's just stunning. The names just leap out at you. And pretty much these people's policies, yeah, this is it. These people's policies are the same as,
you're good.
The same as, of course,
the audio people, we got paywalled here, so it's a New York Times.
Yeah.
So if you want to spend $1 a week, you can get it yourself. So but go ahead.
I'm probably, hopefully, I'll be talking to you about another piece that I just wrote that talks about this in more detail, that uses this piece. But so we'll get to it. But to me, Vance is pretty much positioning himself, looking as if he's a white Christian guy from Appalachia, whose grandma kept their refrigerator for 80 years. In reality, he's funded by the same networks as Vivek. And if you look at Vivek's plans for governor of Ohio, which he's running for, he wants to bring in major tech corporations. He wants to centralize the education system. He wants to make schooling 365 days a year. He wants to mandate that everyone say the pledge and the national anthem. I mean, all of these things that are not really about bringing back factory jobs, or not really about strengthening labor unions for the private sector, or not really about helping small businesses. They're about helping some carpetbaggers get money, move from Silicon Valley to Ohio, and I think if you look at Vance and who he's fundraising for, that's going to be the type of thing he wants to do too. He's going to be the agent of Palantir, but he'll be more palatable because he can speak as quote unquote a hillbilly.
Yeah, if you're gonna look into the fundraising, I don't know if you know of this already. I was trying to look it up to see if I could find the specific receipts, but I almost swear there's truth to the fact that Les Wexner was funding J.D. Vance during the period of time of which Epstein was his power of attorney. I might be wrong. I'm just throwing that lead out there. I guess not even lead. It's already been out there.
They're both Ohio.
Yeah, in the Ohio connection. So I'm just saying, you may want to, if you do look at a fundraising, you may want to have that little factoid because that would definitely bolster whatever point you're making big time. But
they do have a connection. I mean, I got to look into this, but they do apparently have a connection.
Yeah.
Thanks for telling me that. I had no idea.
Yeah, I was trying to find it. I couldn't find it. I mean, I'm pretty sure. I mean, this is a vague recollection, so perhaps I'm entirely wrong. I mean, maybe we'll mention this next week. But as we're talking Palantir here, we've talked Vivek, we've talked JD, we've already mentioned the connection here. Hell, we talked about Les Wexner being in Ohio just now. I mean, if we're talking about the Zionist Hindutva thing, if you want to focus in on Palantir for a moment, you got, I mean, hell, we got the head dog, Teal. Let's be real, that's fucking CIA. It was created by In-Q-Tel for the jump, which is CIA, which is a CIA seed money thing. So whatever. So you got the CIA, then you got Alex Karp. Let's be real, that guy has gone. I mean, he's a Jewish guy, let's be real, and he's been extremely forthcoming about his opinions on things like Gaza and stuff like that. And then you have the CTO that you've already mentioned, their chief technology officer over there, who is a Hindu guy or Indian guy. Yeah, and he's a major funder of plenty of Hindutva type people like Krishna Murtha. I almost don't even want to try to say a bunch of these guys' names. But he was a big funder of him, so you have all this swirling around. It itself is seemingly a kind of a production of this paradigm, this concept that's kind of unfolded with Palantir, and it's a little bit freaky when you kind of think about what Palantir has made itself into, especially with this big push for immigration. And then kind of especially when you look at kind of what they're doing in other countries with this very same kind of basic idea of like these smart cities and how we're going to kind of control a perfect grid using AI and yada yada, and kind of how that can get, I mean, sure, if we only use it for security purposes, maybe not so bad, but if you get into the point where, we got to control for regressive movements against merit, maybe they'll take on a different form entirely,
Look, I wish I'd have written that. I couldn't, I want to write that down. I couldn't say that better. That's exactly it. I mean, the moment, because I mean, what you're referring to is, in the piece I mentioned that there's a proposal put by a powerful Hindutva player, Rajiv Malhotra, who's a big fan of Vivek Ramaswamy, saying that Jews and Hindus need to unite and use AI to track down anti-Jewish and anti-Hindu sentiment. Well, in practice, a lot of this sentiment is not anti-Jewish or anti-Hindu. It's anti-Hindutva and anti-Zionist, or it's simply anti-institutional. But in these people's read, if you criticize the institutions, or if you criticize Zionism or Hindutva, the notion that because Jews and Hindus are more successful in these institutions, they are somehow better, and we should all aspire to them. If you criticize that in this estimation, you're discriminating. So the notion of having an AI-based system, modeled, we're told, after Israel's Iron Dome, but online, that is trawling through people's comments and picking them. I mean, that's social credit scores to a nightmarish extent. And then there are all these other connections, with Palantir. I mean, if you Another big guy at Palantir is or was until a year ago Mike Gallagher, who's a former sort of anti-Trump Republican congressman, deeply connected to the military corporate complex, deeply connected to some people who are also connected to the military corporate complex, who are linked to Epstein. I mean, very, very shady stuff. And, the bridge from Vance to Gallagher, if you look on the surface, you'd say, well, Gallagher's kind of a never Trump guy and Vance is a pro-Trump guy. And so they're all the difference in the world. Actually, if you look at the networks that they're dependent on, there's not much difference at all.
Didn't Vance say he was like worse than Hitler? Some crazy nonsense, some blue-haired nonsense, like worse than Hitler. Or maybe I'm wrong. I swear he has a few crazy quotes that are like border on like blue-haired libtard type territory. Which, I don't like Trump, but my critiques come from a different place.
Well, Vance was there were private texts that I think were revealed when he was announced as the vice president. Vance was very anti-Trump in 2016, and then he moved towards Trump, and he'd gotten bad, there had been some negative feedback to the movie that was adopted of Hillbilly Elegy, his book. And I had thought, I'd sort of related, I'd been in some of the elite institutions, I tried to persuade some of these people, in my own way. I hadn't made the connections Vance did, but I knew powerful players, and I tried to persuade them of things, and I realized that wasn't a possibility. They wouldn't be persuaded. And so I thought, well, Vance is turning populist. I understand. I don't think he's doing it, I don't think he's necessarily doing it just for career reasons. I can sort of relate. Well, when you look at him now, his biggest backer in Washington, that's sort of more old school, America First, the American conservative, they're running pieces saying, for Vance, it's a time for choosing. Do you really believe in what you're saying? What you said, or are you completely with the Zionists and the imperialists? So I think Vance, and you got this. The only other person besides you was Connor Freeman, who I was reading on Twitter. You got this way ahead of the curve. I think Vance is pretty much showing what he is.
Yeah, now to be fair, I'll give Fuentes a lot of credit. He was way ahead of it. Not that I'm someone who like regularly follows that or got it from him. I instinctually had some issues, but he's been on his ass for the jump. He noticed some of these links pretty early on. Obviously, I have my skepticism about Fuentes at times as well, but he was on Vance's ass. He's maybe he definitely has a blind spot when it comes to the Bannons of the world, but when it came to Vance, he was on that shit real quick. And yeah, there's a lot of wild stuff, especially like we were talking about the swirling around the Epstein stuff. Kind of makes you wonder, especially when kind of the Teal connections. Very leaves a lot to be concerned about, especially when you look about what does Teal come from? What is Teal all about? That's a whole other episode all on its own. But I think we hit the docket of things really to hit today. But so Matt, where can people find you at? And we'll do this again. Probably another one coming this Wednesday. So assuming nothing falls through, and we'll put this one out tomorrow for the pores, for our lower caste members of the fandom. But with that, Matt, where can people find you at?
oppo-research.com, and then it's my Twitter handles on my name on here, oppo__research on Twitter, where I repost a lot of things.
All right, sorry, I think you cut out a little bit there for a second. I got it all though. For those who want to support what I'm doing, leave a like, share, subscribe, comment, leave a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify. You can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, all the major audio podcatchers, and Twitter as well. On Twitter, that's at TarragangJose. Everywhere else, it's No Way Jose. Just look up No Way Jose and you will find it. If you want to support the show the best way you can, you do it with money over at patreon.com/NoWayJose2020. If you look up here, top left-hand corner is a QR code. You can use that as well. But patreon.com/NoWayJose2020, the low level of $2 gives you access to a whole host of perks. give you guys access to 1 to 2 paywalled episodes per week. Typically, I try to keep about 3 to 4 behind the paywall at any given time. Give you guys access to the ad-free RSS feed, the Telegram, and the pre-show, post-show, and video calls, and me and Austin's weekly live call-in show, Already Dead, which goes out on Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Also, give a big shout out to my sponsors. As a big thank you for their support. That's the highest level of my Patreon. A big thank you to Toad, my previous co-host and Tower Gang, at Learn to Toad, also at Brigade D's, at ZWRCK, at _ Infinite Zeal, Tim Tuttle, at John Klebo, big fan of the show, Torn May, at Wayne Tackus, One Hair Car for Kids, No Free Lunch, Jack, Mark Vestibule, and Jacob Wintergrad at the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. We'll be back with another one of these for you guys here soon. Do all the things. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.